thank you everybody for joining us today for this Women in Tech keynote speech. We're very excited to have Noelle with us. Um, so um, I'm just very honored to be able to invite Noelle today. Noelle Silver Russell is a multi-award winning technologist and entrepreneur who specializes in advising companies on emerging technologies such as cloud and AI and Web 3.0. Not only has she been leading teams over her career at NPR and Microsoft and IBM and Amazon Alexa, but she's also a real champion, not only for AI literacy and the ethical use of AI, but also for women in technology. I'm sure if you follow Noelle, you'll see a lot of the very positive work that she's been doing in the DEI space. And I definitely think that, you'll see that she's just a huge advocate for women in our quite often male-dominated IT world. So very excited to have her with us today. She's done a ton of work working on building some of the largest AI models in the world, and she's also the founder of the AI Leadership Institute, and was recently awarded Microsoft's Most Valuable Professional Award for Artificial Intelligence. In addition to that, she was also awarded VentureBeat's Women in AI Responsibility and Ethics Award. So with that, I will hand over to Noelle, who is our keynote speaker for this morning.
I am here today to talk about a very large topic, but I always like to start with why I'm here. Why do I do what I do? Why do I, every day go through the challenges that I go through? And I want to introduce you to kind of my reason for being. I was just recently got married. So my husband, of course, a huge part of my life, my 4 children, now realize how important it is to advocate to everyone, specifically women in tech, how available, and Lisa is one of these leaders as well, but how available having work-life harmony is to women in technology. I think sometimes, especially when we're younger, we think we kind of have to go all in or we have to make a choice. And I, of course, 4 children later, over 17 years, I really focused on not making my life either or, but really focusing more on a both and philosophy. And you'll see that echoed through a lot of the things we'll talk about today. But some of the main reasons, one of the most common questions I'm asked today is, how'd you get involved in AI, or how'd you get involved even in tech? And I got involved in tech very, very early. I was actually introduced to technology through science fiction. My dad loved the golden, and still today loves the golden age of science fiction. Bradbury, Asimov, iRobot, you name the science fiction author, Arthur C. Clarke. He loved these authors and introduced them to me as soon as really I could read chapter books. And so as a result, I always kind of lived in this dream world where we could talk to robots, where robots were our assistants, where, yes, in some cases, these stories did not end well, but in most cases, there was a good human story connected to all of this technology. And so that took me on an early journey into technology. But what really catapulted my career was, and you'll see him there in the pool, when my son was born. And when my son was born, he was born with Down syndrome. This is all 17 years ago. And at the time, I was advised by my geneticist that there wasn't much available to him. The world was not ready for him. He could not easily operate in this world. And so I really should put him up for adoption, or give him, put him in an institution where they could really take care of his needs. Needless to say, I did not go down that route. I am a technologist after all. Instead, I started to handcraft the companies that I chose to work in order to move in the direction of technology that could help not only my son specifically, but really anyone with differing abilities or divergent thinking in general. My journey into AI was catapulted in 2014 or 2013, 2014 timeframe, when Alexa first launched. I was part of the initial team of Alexa skill developers. I built over 100 applications for Alexa. my hands on a keyboard. I'm an independent developer, which means I don't have a development staff. I do all the coding, testing, building, infrastructuring, all on my own. Today, all my skills run on AWS. They all run through Lambda. I have to update them because I love AWS. The infrastructure keeps evolving, which forces me as the developer to evolve my skills and understanding. But in building all of those skills, I actually built them across 4 languages. So I already knew Java. That's what I grew up in Java. But I had to learn Node.js because that was the first language we supported on Amazon Alexa. I had to learn Python, and now most of us learn Python as our first language. But I had to pick that up. Luckily, I had a really strong foundation in Java, so it made learning these languages easier. But it was a necessity in order for me to reach the customers that I wanted to reach. Well, in that first year at Amazon, my dad ended up getting into a car accident, and he was not in a car. He was walking across the street, and a distracted driver wasn't paying attention and hit him as a pedestrian. And he was at that point running, walking like 11 to 15 miles a day. He's a Marine, like very fit. And he instantly aged like overnight. Went from using, I mean, he had a smartphone that he ran with. It had Map My Run on it. He had playlists. Instantly went from, basically being technically literate and able to like function in the world to not being able to hold a smartphone, not being able to use a computer. And so I'm on Alexa, of course, and my focus instantly was like, okay, how can I use this to help him? But I'll tell you more about this in a little bit. But it's interesting how when you're in an environment, right, and a lot of people are thinking in a certain direction, it's hard sometimes to be that divergent voice, to raise your hand and be the one person who says, should we do it a little differently? But I'm going to encourage you over the next hour or so to go with me on the journey of always being the one to raise my hand and just, super like not trying to hurt anyone's feelings, but just ask them to think about things in a different way. And there's lots of ways to go about it, and we're going to go through some of those. But my dad's accident really catapulted me into the world of AI. Today, I have since, like I was at Amazon for 4 years, loved working there. I always say I got my MBA at Amazon because I learned so many critical business skills at working in both AWS and at Amazon Alexa. I then went on to work at Microsoft and was, as you can see in my departure, awarded the most valuable professional award in AI. One of my favorite awards I got at Microsoft was around mindfulness. You know, and you could see there's like a ninja cat that I got as a result. And it was the first time that in a technical organization I was celebrated for my divergent thinking, right? My, hey, let's do a minute of mindfulness before this meeting, which was weird for most people. Like most people were not meditating on a daily basis, certainly not before a work meeting. But it actually changed the velocity of our productivity. It changed our intention in that meeting. Like so many benefits came from this practice that I ended up getting a cool little 3D printed ninja cat out of it, which was really fun. Now, I've spent the last 7 years doing this work of advocating for really inclusive technology, and I've learned a couple of really important things. And one of them is really around how we measure success as an organization, as an individual. And I want to share with you this quote. And the reason I share it with you is because it was first shared with me by Mr. Jeff Bezos himself. Don't worry, no, I mean, he didn't like send it to me, like text me, hey, Noelle, look at this quote. No, that didn't happen. He tweeted it out. But when he did, I noticed and I was like, well, that's interesting. And so Jeff Bezos tweeted out this. And then as I moved in my career to other companies, I noticed other senior executive leaders doing the same thing. Satya Nadella, Arvind at IBM, Jim Whitehurst at Red Hat. Like some of them have gone on to do other things, but at the time they were leading some of the largest companies in the world. And they were using this quote as a way of focusing attention. And so I want to share it with you, and then I want to share with you a special story about it. So what is success? And I always think to myself, like, I'm a data-driven person. I like to be focused, right, on what am I measuring myself against? And so I really like the way this gives me some ideas about what to be measuring. What is success? To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics, and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate the beauty, to find the best in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. And I love this quote because I'm like, yes, exactly. There's so many ways that we can value success, and none of this says build a product, make $1 billion, right? Like, I liked that these very, very affluent leaders, successful people in the world were focusing and telling their children, like, this is what success is. And I got off stage one day after sharing this quote. I've been sharing this quote for years. I love it. I got off stage one day and a man came up to me and he was like, you should research that quote a little bit. And I was like, why? And he's like, just go look it up. And I am coachable, right? So I was like, all right, I'll go look it up. I go look it up, and not on page one, maybe page two, but certainly on page three, I realized that this quote actually was written not by the person who is famed to have written it, Ralph Waldo Emerson, but actually it was written by Bessie Anderson Stanley, a woman. And at that time, she wrote this poem. Ralph Waldo Emerson took the poem, probably at first gave her due credit, right? But over time, the lineage of her relationship to this poem was lost. And this becomes a critical message to us as we move into the technical world. I'm a big believer in responsible AI. It's something I spend a lot of time talking about, and really responsible technology. And one of those responsibilities is to preserve the lineage, the truth about what we are actually sharing with the world. As we move into data and creating business intelligence dashboards that are crafting a story about the data, it's really important that we remember where that data came from, right? That we remember, on behalf of the Bessie Anderson Stanleys of the world, that we preserve the lineage of where our stories come from. And so I think it's really interesting, right, to find out that this super popular quote that is well known to be Ralph Waldo Emerson's actually isn't, and not because it's anyone's fault. Responsible AI or ethical challenges we have with AI are often unintentional, but it doesn't make it right, right? So now I spend a little bit of time in every talk that I have sharing with you, of course, this story and this, what happened, but also giving some props to Bessie so that she gets, some love. But more importantly, teaching a very fundamental principle, which is preserve the lineage of any story that you tell, especially when we're doing it in data and leveraging AI models to create, multi-layered decisions off of that original data point. It's extremely important. And the best, most successful AI projects in the world have done this very well. So, of course, today, I'm about to share with you things that I've uncovered, things that have made me extremely successful as really a technologist. I mean, the fact that I'm a woman, of course, I think maybe has something to do with my success, but probably because it forced me to be even more determined. And I'll talk to you more about that in a moment. But today, there are so many ways to get involved in technology, even if you don't know how to code, or even if you don't want to learn to be a programmer, or that's not a persona you see yourself as. As a matter of fact, I was recently on a stage with a bunch of, there was data scientists, there was VC funding, venture capital people, there was 6 or 7 of us. And a question was asked about user experience and how, designers, right, and where their role was in the data science space. And all the practitioners, I'm a practitioner, but I'm not a classically trained data scientist. I don't sit and write algorithms all day. That's not my job. Though I love people that do that, and that's awesome for them. But that's not what I do. But that's who was on the stage, and they literally didn't have any concept of user experience. They didn't really. They were like, yeah, we don't really do that really at all. And it led me to this interesting epiphany, which was, well, no wonder we have AI projects that when they go into production end up hurting people or end up accidentally infringing on someone's rights because the user experience person, the person who would look at that and go, that might not be a good idea, that person isn't even at the table. And really, that person could be you, right? I'm not a classically trained data scientist, though I love learning. So I've learned data science. I am not at all aware before I got into Alexa of what natural language processing was or speech recognition, but I learned all of these things, one out of passion and interest for my family, but also mostly because I actually saw this huge opportunity for the world. And so today we have more power than ever, more capability, more services. Amazon has this amazing service set in SageMaker. There's a marketplace full of technology that you can use. I know I have lots of different friends that are building companies that are putting things in Amazon's marketplace every day that'll help you, rather than you building a model from scratch, you become the person that applies the model. We call them applied AI engineers. So there's so much capability out there. But I always like to say this quote, and hopefully you will think it in your head as I say it out loud. But with great power comes great, hopefully you've heard this one, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And we right now are in this moment of history where we can do amazing things with the technology that's been created, but we need to do it responsibly. We need to think about not only who we will help. I actually call this concept design justice. Not just who will you help, but also who could you hurt? And that question is almost never asked at the beginning of AI projects. And the reason why is because usually we don't think it's going to touch that many people. Usually we've created a persona. Some of you in marketing might be familiar with this term, right? We've created a persona and we look at that persona and we think this persona would not be hurt by this. But here's the reality of artificial intelligence. The reality of artificial intelligence is you have no idea how it will be used. To give you an example, in my early days at Amazon Alexa, I was part of the skills team. I was the only one who looked like me, we'll say that. I was the only female evangelist, solutions architect at the time, early days. And when I had an idea to build some skills that would be helpful to my family, my team kind of looked at me, who, again, they were all in a different stage of life. They didn't have kids, they weren't married. Some of them had dogs, but I didn't have a dog. So we were just different. And I would say to them, like, hey, we should build a category of skills of, applications for Alexa around mindfulness. And I remember them looking at me like, what? Like, this is a kitchen device, Noelle. Who needs mindfulness in the kitchen? And as a mom, and some of you parents out there can relate, like that is sometimes the best place for us to get a little calm, a little breathing, a little mindfulness, right? And so I represented this perspective that the team just didn't have. And I've come to represent this, concept, and really hopefully throughout this talk to you about these different things that you can do in the world to bring what you see in through your life lens, right? Your life experience, how that life experience could actually impact these projects. And the reason I mention that is because when I first started with that mindfulness skill, I built it anyway. Jeff Bezos was awesome like that, right? You always want to work for a leader who doesn't hinder you from doing something that everyone thinks is crazy, as long as it doesn't keep you from doing the needful things. And so I was given a lot of license to build these skills nobody really thought would work. Today, those skills are some of the most popular. I have 2 million users plus of my skills today as an independent developer who is not classically trained in anything, really, right? Who's just passionate and persistent about learning what I learned. Now, of course, I did learn Java early in my career. I did start at AWS, so I knew cloud really well. I became a certified solutions architect. So I understood I had a lot of foundational components, but I didn't let the person come to me and say, oh, that's not going to work. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, you're probably right. Right? As a woman in tech, I hear those types of comments a lot, and I've learned to just take it in, evaluate it. I always like the concept of positive and negative feedback. Like maybe there is something here that I could change. But then if I do that due diligence and I still think what I'm doing is valuable, I move forward anyway. And so there's so many different ways that AI can impact the world. Um, but there's a couple principles that are required for an organization and for you to really understand in order to do AI well. These are hard-learned lessons that I'm about to share with you, and I'll share a couple of reasons why I came up with this along the way. The first one, and there's a group of us who started in the early days of Alexa and then also in the early days at Microsoft, where we started to see certain patterns of AI that did well and AI that failed. And this is the number one reason why AI is successful, is because you have paid attention to building an inclusive engineering team. And I say engineering because I always work in engineering, but really it's an inclusive team in general, an inclusive company. Now, when I say inclusive, I don't just mean brown people like me, right? Or even women like me. I actually mean a much broader range of inclusivity, right? I'm talking about building a symphony of talent, right? Building a symphony so that you have, people who are introverted and extroverted, right? You have people that are, parents and people who aren't parents, people who are taking care of their own parents and those that aren't, right? You have people that think fast and need time to process, people that communicate very, very well, and those that are much more, quiet and like to process things. All of these different ways of being, different levels of humanity. I mean, I want people on my team, I want is extremely diverse backgrounds, right? I don't want everyone who went to the same, collection of schools, who all went to Ivy League schools or all went to state schools, right? I want somebody who didn't go to school at all, like me, or someone who maybe went to school, maybe went to community college and then went to a boot camp. The lessons you learn as a human are so different when you take these different life paths to the same team. And those perspectives bring up extremely diverse ideas. Something I learned while I was an executive at IBM was the garage method, is what they call it. But it really is a process of kickstarting an inclusive engineering process at your team or in your company, right? One of them, and if you're a leader, this is great because you can now shift your mindset around your hiring process to be much more open. One of the before I get into the garage process, one of the things that I'm worried about, that keeps me up at night, honestly, is that I've hired at Amazon, at Microsoft, and National Public Radio, I have hired lots of people, thousands. I've interviewed thousands, hired hundreds. And it was during Alexa, so we were doing massive hiring when I was there. But I've interviewed so many people in my career, and I've never once interviewed anyone in a wheelchair. Never, not once. I've never had anyone in my interview processes say this person has opted in for adaptive technology to help the interview. Never, even though that's given to all of us, if we have that option. And it forces me to think there's got to be something like that's not right. I mean, now I go to conferences and I meet with people that have cerebral palsy or that have, that are quadriplegic or that are in a wheelchair, suffer some sort of paralysis. And, they're software engineers. They could not find a place in our world. Therefore, they went and started their own companies. But why? Like inclusive engineering, that's such an important perspective to have, right? Someone's perspective that comes from that. Now I start to see kind of similar to what I saw 20 years ago with having people of color in an organization, maybe we have one, right? Maybe there's one person who has a wheelchair or one person who's deaf or, but the fact that I've never interviewed one just causes me to think now much more intentionally about that pipeline, right? We're not just talking about women and people of color. We're talking about all divergent people who don't fit the mold that currently is the DNA of our organizations. And the reason why is because when we build software, I'll tell you at Alexa, when we started, we had 1,000 beta testers, and I will give you just an assumption that they were all kind of the same people, came from the same pool, right? We now have at Alexa, there's more than 100 million homes that have an Alexa in it. They're not, it's impossible that they'd all be the same, right? It's also now very likely we didn't serve all of them well in the design of that product, but we could have, right? We could have done a better job of thinking, if I have 100 million users, I can't really target a single persona anymore. I have to target everyone, right? I have to think about everyone. And I know it sounds overwhelming, but the delta actually in the design phase of thinking about all of these ideas is actually not very different than what you would do if you weren't thinking in this way. The difference happens at the end when you launch a product that serves more people and your brand becomes a brand that people care about. So one of the things with inclusive engineering that I find really helpful is when we bring organizations together. So I have this policy I call from the boardroom to the whiteboard to the keyboard. It's like a philosophy, if you will, but it's also a practice that I do. I go into companies and I do this all the time. And the intention is to help the senior leaders in an organization, right, have an executive briefing of sorts, get an understanding and awareness of the cultural change that has to happen within their company in order for them to build and survive in the next 10 years, right? It's very similar to the world we were in 2008, right, when we were doing this e-commerce thing. And a lot of CEOs are like, I'm not sure that's for us. All of them, if they're still in business today, had to come to realization that that's where we are, that we're in a transactional e-commerce world. But the later you were to that game, the more opportunity you lost. And so we're in that same cycle with artificial intelligence. The early adopters are seeing early wins, but unless they built an organization with a culture, an AI-ready culture, and inclusive engineering is part of that, if you haven't built an AI-ready culture, the leadership will not be able to sustain and successfully build that technology. So then we go to the senior technical leadership and we whiteboard out the tech part, right? This is what my favorite part. It's when we go in and we talk about the infrastructure, right? Most organizations have AWS, and usually have some level of certified architects. We get them in the room and we talk about, here's what your world is today. But with the advent of artificial intelligence, where could it be tomorrow, 6 months from now, a year from now? And I'll share with you some of the use cases that our CEOs that we talked to in a study said were the most interesting areas for them to invest in AI. So back to that garage method that I mentioned, IBM has this garage method, and it's such an interesting, it's very agile if you're familiar with agile methodologies. But it says start, right? When you do this boardroom to the whiteboard, right? You've got now your executive leadership and senior technical leadership on the same page as far as what you have now and where you're going to go. Now you go to the keyboard, you build an internal hackathon. And you do this internal hackathon by bringing together not just the technologists. As a matter of fact, at National Public Radio, we named it Serendipity Days. So people wouldn't be attached to the idea that it was a technical thing. We wanted to bring the domain experts, the people in HR, the people in legal, the people in procurement, right? The people in product, the people in user experience, and we wanted to combine them in a fun, engaging way with the technology teams. And I'll tell you one, we've done this, I've done this a couple of times in a big way. One of them was for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was one of my favorite projects because we did the same thing. We went into the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we did this boardroom to the whiteboard to the keyboard. We got to the hackathon moment and we said, all the curators, come on in, and we're going to bring a bunch of MIT data scientists and sit you side by side. And immediately they were like, I'm not sure I like you. Right? Data scientists were like, I don't know anything about art. And the art people were like, you know nothing about art. Right? And they weren't sure how tech would help them. They weren't sure if tech could even help them do art curation, to care and feed for the artwork that they managed over, it's like 6,000 or 7,000 years of art. They couldn't see a path to how technology could be supportive or augmenting. So we got them together, and a critical question was asked by the team, the tech team, the data science team. They went to the curators and they said, in your day-to-day operations, what brings you pain? What are things about your job you do not like, you don't want to do, you wish we could fix? And when you ask a question like that and you mean it, and you are like seriously asking them to share their pains with you, like it's a flood, like, oh, well, there's an app from 1988 that we haven't been updated. This other one never works. We have to use these 3 processes. They're all written. We have to document everything on clipboards. All this stuff started coming out, and the data scientists were like, we could help you with that. In that process, and this is the garage process, though I didn't know it then, but it's very similar to the way that IBM does things as well, is that it's a cyclical process, and it starts with this ideation of 100 different ideas. So we have this inclusive engineering group, right? We have everyone in the room, product owners, customers if you can, right? Executives, developers, managers, everyone comes, and they're in this, single room, and you just ask people what's wrong, and you just write every single idea on the board, right? On a post-it sheet, whatever the case might be. From those 100, you then ask a very critical question. And if you're taking notes, this is one you'll want to take down, right? A very critical question from the brainstorming of ideas. We want to then ask one question: what does our data look like? Of all of these 100, what's the easiest way for us to get data? In other words, there's got to be some of those that have data that's easy to access than others. So we prioritize based on data availability, data access, and privacy. All right, what can we leverage? Out of that, now, in order to get a really good list of 100, you're going to need a lot of different perspectives, right? You're going to need the mom, you're going to need the person who loves art, the person who loves music, right? You're going to need the person who has a dog, and the person who, runs half marathons or is a triathlete. You're going to need all these perspectives to be like, oh my gosh, we could use this, because their brains all will trigger different features and different capabilities that you might want to prioritize as a team. So this is where I really like, there's a principle at AWS that I love all of those leadership principles that I learned there. They help me do everything I do today. But one of them, especially in an inclusive engineering group, sticks out to me, and it is called disagree and commit. And what that means is that in an inclusive team, and I remember at NPR, we had these glass rooms, people would walk by and they would think we were fighting. They'd be like, is everything okay in here? Like, are you all all right? And the reality is that we were having, it was a little maybe, everyone had a chance to share their idea, even if they were dissenting ideas, even if they were, and actually especially if they were different and new and not what we had been talking about already. But here is the important thing: every idea was acknowledged, was heard, was documented, right? Every idea was captured. And then we went through this exercise and prioritized, okay, of all these ideas, let's prioritize 10. If your idea was not prioritized, you would then, agree to disagree, right? You'd be like, okay, well, I really think mine should be in the top 10, but okay, all right, no problem. And then you would commit, right? Disagree, meaning I don't agree that my idea isn't being taken, but I'm committing to the new ideas, these next 10, as if they were my own. I'm going to commit to the idea that ends up being chosen by my leadership or ends up being chosen by, a consortium. I'm going to now commit to that new idea as if it was my own idea. And that takes a special level of emotional intelligence, right? Like it requires you to be able to kind of swallow your pride and move in the direction that's best for the company, because that's the direction the leadership decided to go in, even if you disagree with it. The benefit with that is that your idea is heard and documented and you know it. The other benefit, though, is that you have many, many opportunities to provide new information into that process that can be helpful. And we never, at any point in that process, are shutting people down, which can happen if you don't have this inclusive kind of vibe going. So you start with 100 ideas, you then dwindle it down to 10 based on data access. From that, you'll find usually we say pick 3 that are worth building a POC for. And then those 3, you pile on everyone who's in the hackathon, you get them to build out components, right, that are in these 3 prototypes, and you'll end up, well, usually we have a voting session, we bring in the executives, super high profile, there's swag involved, hoodies, trophies, right? And we award one organization with funding to, or one of these projects with funding to live to see another day. They get to play with that product and see what happens over the next 6 months. And what we found out actually at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we ended up getting 17 projects out of that initial brainstorming session. And 3 of them were extremely successful. 2 of them made NBC nightly news as far as, you know, building inclusive technology to allow people who can't go to the museum to experience the museum's work. And it was really impactful. If you want to see the story, it's pinned on my Twitter profile. You can go check it out. But it's such a touching story because they never would have built that thing if they didn't go through this process of inviting people into a room that maybe wouldn't have gotten along normally, right? The tech people and the art people. But when we left, they hugged each other goodbye. I thought that was the biggest telltale sign, right? Of when you've done it right, is when the business user is like familial, right? They're like family, you know, like, we got you, we are friends now, because you helped us solve a problem we couldn't solve by ourselves. And that was really powerful. So inclusive engineering is huge. Now, the second principle that we've learned when building these massive models that served lots of people is you can't really go in or go all in on one modality. And when I say one modality, most organizations, like you probably, have an app, right? A web application, a website. And when you have a website, that's great. That we've been doing that for a while. We call that like Web 1.0, maybe Web 2.0 with some transactions associated with it, or e-commerce. But when you're building that, right, you've got this experience that is either people on their desktop, which is one experience, people on mobile, which is another experience, and then enter voice, right? So I'm on the Alexa team, a few years ago, and I remember the mantra at that time was voice first, voice only, voice everywhere. And really we meant Alexa, right? We were trying to create a household name. And the good news is we actually did create a household name as a result. So that's fantastic. But in doing and creating this voice first mentality, we actually accidentally truncated or maybe even elongated it. It changed the trajectory of our success because we were instantly exclusive. It's kind of like, for those of you familiar with Clubhouse, when Clubhouse first came out, they didn't have any accessibility features. And so when someone came out, like if you were on Clubhouse, the only people who could be there were people who could hear. Similarly with Alexa, at the beginning, the only people who could use it were people who could talk very well and in a certain way. A funny story, I got off the stage one day, somewhere in, the first couple years of Alexa, and a woman came up to me and said, you know, I don't understand, why does Alexa listen to my husband more than it listens to me? And I kind of laughed it off. I was like, that's, a little awkward silence. But as a data scientist, I started thinking, wait, why would that be? And it wasn't a one-off, right? There was a whole subreddit on women screaming at their Alexas only to have husbands walk in and just say it and it would work. Maybe it's happened to some of you. It's super frustrating. But it turns out that unfortunately, right, when that data was collected to train the model, an email was sent, a data collection activity was done, but it attracted, right, the mechanism we use to collect data, it only attracted people who could stay late after work, who could come in early, who could show up at lunch to give that data. And it turned out that most of those people were men. And so the data was trained more on a male voice than on female voices. It's been, remedied, right? This is not just true for men, right? Men were the initial data set, but now, of course, women, we now, Alexa, I know, focuses on voices that are aging, right? Which is a different voice than someone in their 30s. Also, children's voices, speaker identification, being able to identify the difference between my teenage son and myself. So there's lots of evolution, but at the very beginning, because we didn't know who was using it, we didn't think about this. We didn't have someone in the room going, hey, I'm a wife. Let's make sure it serves my husband and my wife the same, or my husband and me the same, right? No one really brought that up. It wasn't even in the mindset of those who are basically taking this product to production and deploying it. So I always encourage us now to think these thoughts, right? Ask the question, who are we going to serve with this? And ask that question of people who aren't in your group, right? Like, go to someone and say, hey, like me, when I got that email from Jeff Bezos saying, hey, come join Alexa, I instantly thought of my son. That was like the use case that instantly, I'm like, oh my gosh, a device you could talk to, I could help my son speak better, this could be awesome. And it was not in the realm of conception for the team that I joined. They were like, what? No, 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 this is a kitchen device. We're building timers, music, stuff you do in the kitchen. Today, Alexa's in the classroom. Speech pathologists leverage Alexa. We just weren't thinking about it back then. And we could change that. So now I encourage you, as you get into these teams, don't be afraid. As a woman in technology, as a divergent thinker, as someone who has a unique life experience, you're going to have ideas pop into your head and you're going to be like, oh, yeah, I probably shouldn't do that, right? You're going to get an idea that is divergent from the path your team is on. And you want to, maybe not, if you're not, don't want to raise your hand and be like, blow up the meeting and talk about something totally different, but at least find a champion, your manager, or maybe the head of the organization, or even the CEO, and articulate what you're thinking. Because those ideas often are leading ideas that end up making AI projects even more successful. Now, it does require us to think a little bit more broadly about the leadership in our organizations, which is what I'm doing now, right? I'm trying to go into executive organizations, like into the C-suite of companies, and educate them on how powerful and important creating a culture that allows you to voice your ideas, no matter how crazy they might seem, right? Oh my gosh, mindfulness in the kitchen, crazy, right? Kindness, all my skills were around kindness, mindfulness, affirmations, positive prayer. None of those were on the hit list for our product at the beginning. But they ended up becoming incredibly successful and opening up a niche, an area of the market that we weren't even thinking about. More customers means more business, means everybody wins. And we weren't thinking about that. We weren't thinking about that world. So now we're moving into a world where I encourage you in this multimodal phase to be thinking, one, how do I make sure that when I'm building something, that I don't kind of sit back and relax and go, I'm going to build a web app, and maybe I'm going to build a bootstrapped or a responsive web application that's the same on both web and mobile, that I actually think about, how do I use voice? I will tell you that it is much more, it's frictionless for someone to be able to just talk to their tech instead of have to go to a phone and type in, right, something. It's so much easier for someone. And most importantly, not is it's easier for us able-bodied people, but for those who have different challenges, they might find it easier to be able to talk. So add one more modality of voice. Today, voice is We have so many different voice enabled or even just natural language services at AWS that you can leverage with a few lines of code in your already existing applications. I love going to AWS documentation because today they have polylines everywhere. And what I mean by that is Poly is a service that reads text to speech. And so it'll say, would you like to have this document page read to you? And I can click on it and it'll just read me the page instead of me having to read it myself. It's like a podcast. I love it, right? But I don't need that accessibility, but it now opens the door to a bunch of people who could never have even viewed that documentation because it wasn't in a medium or a modality that they could work with or understand. So today, I mean, every company can add TTS to their website and allow anyone who cannot read to be able to hear what their application is saying. And let me take it a step further. Another super fun thing you could do today is build a custom voice, right? You can actually create, and this is what we're working on in some of the largest companies, is what does your company sound like? Some of you know certain sounds like the NBC chimes, right? If NBC comes on, maybe not TV watchers anymore, but I know if I hear NBC chimes or the Olympics, right? If you hear the Olympic march, it instantly triggers like, oh, that's the Olympics. Like I know that sound, right? There's jingles and marketing songs, right, that we've heard that kind of stick in our head. Today, similarly, we're starting to see organizations build these conversational agents that have a voice, and that voice is crafted. It's like selected, picked, choreographed, right, to represent the brand. Now, there is one company out there that did something amazing I want to share with you, and you could likely do the same thing if you were so inclined, but they took all of the voices of their entire company, all their employees submitted voices, and they custom trained an AI model to synthesize a gender neutral voice that was a synthesis of every employee they had. Like it gives me goosebumps. I'm like, that's so good. I would do that. That sounds amazing. So these are ways of kind of thinking about modalities and allowing people to interact with you. I can't, of course, leave this principle without mentioning the idea of the third modality, which we're starting to see much more of, which is the metaverse or augmented reality. Right? I don't think I have my glasses nearby, but I have these glasses that I wear often when I get on stage, and they're called Waysharers or something like that. Anyway, they're from Ray-Ban. They were built in conjunction with Meta. Today, the lenses are like blue light lenses, or you can get them prescription. But right now, feature complete, there are lenses that are augmented, which means that when you put the lenses on and you're in a room, LinkedIn could show up on every little person you see. Computer vision could be used to scan who they are, facial recognition mapped to a LinkedIn API, and LinkedIn says, oh, that's your friend. You met them at this conference 2 years ago. This is, how you know them, the last message you sent them. All in the lenses that and they look just like sunglasses, or just like, they're a pretty thick frame, but they look just like normal glasses. Right? It's not like the Google glasses of old, and it's not an over the face, full on virtual headset. So we're starting to see hardware be created to allow us to use gestures, right? I now can stick my hand in front of my glasses and it knows what my hand is, and I can move things aside. I can swipe things. I can close my hand to close a window. Again, rather than using my voice, if voice isn't accessible to me, maybe my hands are accessible. Or maybe in the future, right? And even now there's a lot of research around this. I use my brain activity to trigger this technology. Okay, I won't get too crazy on you, but it's an incredible opportunity. If you are in a team that's building web apps and mobile apps, think multimodal. Think about, how can I include voice? How can I include gesture control? How can I include other modalities to build software that serves more people? Everybody wins, and the delta of work is not exponentially more difficult. It actually is pretty small in comparison to the loss of the audience and the customers you might have. So the final one, I guess is part one of two, is around, of course, ethical and responsible AI. I think I've beat this drum and yelled from the rooftops throughout this about how important it is to think responsibly about the technology that we're building. And in ethical and responsible AI, they're two completely different things. There's lots of people within organizations, actually companies have dedicated teams to thinking about what's ethically right for them to do, right? So big companies, and as a matter of fact, there's been a lot of, we'll say, fanfare around certain people that have brought up issues and then gotten fired as a result, right? So ethics is tough. But one thing every single company can do is be responsible about how they use technology. Be responsible about, remember Bessie Anderson Stanley, right? Be responsible to preserve the lineage of the data that we're collecting and using, and using to help us build better products. So I always mention with responsible AI, there's about 5 different tenets that I like to give you. Again, if you're a note taker, this is the time. I'm going to give you 5 things that you'll want to practice. And there are tools available, open source tools on GitHub that you can use to kind of perfect your ability to monitor these things. But one of them, and they kind of go hand in hand, the first two, transparency and explainability. They are different. Transparency leads to that lineage question. How do I know where the data came from, how a decision is made? How do I know that when you gave me this credit decision, it wasn't based on my race or on my, ethnicity or on my marital status, right? How do I know that? I want to make sure as the business owner that I'm very clear on how decisions are made, especially in neural networks where those decisions are nested upon nested upon nested in these huge networks. So I want to make sure that my systems are transparent in order for me to understand the lineage of these data decisions that are being made every day that could impact people. The second one, explainability, says, okay, now that I have that transparency, how do I explain this to people who are not in the field? This is a cool principle because we didn't have this, I didn't know about explainable tech, wasn't a thing when I was building job applications, but I wish it was, because I was always the one saying we should document better. We should build better documentation for our code. We should document in code better. I was always the one preaching documentation. And for those of you developers or getting into the, people usually roll their eyes at me when I do this because they're like, yeah, I know. We don't have time to document. We're building something here. I get that a lot. But being able to explain your work is extremely valuable, not just because you might one day win the lottery and go to Tahiti and we'll never see you again and your code will be hard to understand, but also because we want to ensure that we can scale what you've done, right? Scale the work that is being built. And that scalability comes with understanding. So we want not just, of course, your team to understand what you did, but we want the leaders in your company to understand it. That's what explainable means. I want to be able to explain it with understanding to my leadership, to executives, to customers, to stakeholders. So those are the first two, transparency and explainability.